She had long ago learned the art of silence. In Kent, where the fields rolled in gentle obedience to the wind and the hedgerows hid more secrets than they sheltered birds, Miss Sophie Ashford carried herself like a well-mannered shadow. She moved quietly through corridors, answered when spoken to, lowered her eyes at the proper moments. It was what the world required of young ladies without fortune. Her father, a naval officer of modest rank, had died when she was still too young to understand what permanence meant. After his passing, her mother, Mrs. Margaret Ashford, remarried with alarming haste. Security, the neighbours had called it. Necessity, her mother had whispered. Thus Sophie found herself installed in Whitmore House, a respectable estate on the outskirts of Canterbury, under the guardianship of Mr. Edmund Whitmore, a man admired in drawing rooms and feared in his own hallways. He had a son from his first marriage, Julian Whitmore, 2 years older, dark-haired, reserved, and possessed of a gaze that seemed always to calculate the cost of every word. To society, Sophie and Julian were siblings. To the law, they were bound by marriage alone. To Sophie, he was something far more complicated. She did not remember the precise moment her feelings changed. Perhaps it had been the first winter after she arrived, when she woke to the sound of raised voices in her mother's chamber. She had crept into the corridor barefoot, trembling, only to find Julian standing outside the door as well. He had not spoken. He had simply placed himself between her and the noise. "Go back to your room," he had said quietly. It was not an unkind instruction, it was protection. Over the years, such gestures accumulated like unseen stitches, holding together a fraying garment. Julian escorted her to church when Edmund could not. Julian corrected her Latin exercises when tutors were dismissed without explanation. Julian intercepted cruel remarks from visiting acquaintances with a glance so cold it silenced them. And yet he was distant, always distant. He never lingered in conversation, never smiled too long, never allowed familiarity beyond what propriety permitted. If Sophie tried to thank him, he would reply with infuriating calm, "You mistake obligation for kindness." If she asked whether he despised her for her mother's presence in his home, he would answer, "You are not responsible for your elders' decisions." But he never said he did not resent her. Whitmore House was governed by more than manners. Mr. Edmund Whitmore ruled his household with a civility so polished it gleamed. Guests admired his wit, investors praised his prudence, clergymen found him charitable. Inside those walls, charity did not extend evenly. Mrs. Ashford had once been lively. Sophie remembered laughter before Kent, before Whitmore. After the marriage, her mother grew pale, then compliant, then fragile. When Sophie turned 17, she began to understand why. It began with invitations to Edmund's study under harmless pretenses, a ledger to retrieve, a letter to carry. A birthday gift, he had once murmured, as though indulgence were affection. Julian had arrived that night, precisely when he was needed. He had said nothing afterward, but within a fortnight arrangements were made for Sophie to continue her education in London, under the pretense of refinement, under the necessity of removal. On the evening before her departure, she stood beneath the bare branches of the orchard, her gloved fingers clenched around the iron gate. "You ought to go," Julian said behind her. She did not turn. "If I leave," she asked quietly, "will you be relieved?" Silence lingered between them. The sky had already dimmed to violet. "You should see the world beyond Kent," he replied. "Dependence breeds illusion." She faced him then. "I do not depend on you." His jaw tightened. "You do." The words were not cruel. They were deliberate. "Then why," she pressed, her breath unsteady, "did you never send me away sooner?" For the first time in years, he faltered, only for a heartbeat. "You misunderstand attachment," he said at last. "Affection born of confinement is not love." It was the first time he had used the word, love. She felt it strike her like a confession and a denial at once. "I care for you," she whispered. The orchard seemed to hold its breath. He stepped back as though she had reached for him with flame. "You are young, and you are a coward," she said softly, though tears threatened. His expression hardened. "I will not have you ruined by sentiment." She almost laughed at the irony, as if ruin were not already circling her life like a vulture. Inside the house, Edmund's voice echoed faintly, calling for a servant. Julian's composure returned. "You leave at dawn," he said. "Do not look back." The carriage wheels sounded mercilessly loud the next morning. Sophie did not look at him as she stepped inside. If she had, she might have seen the tremor in his hand. In London, she was installed in a modest but respectable residence in Bloomsbury. Officially, it belonged to a family acquaintance. In truth, Julian's funds sustained it. He visited rarely. When he did, he maintained careful distance. No doors closed improperly, no gestures prolonged. He behaved precisely as an honourable brother should. Society observed nothing amiss. Yet rumours, like drafts under a door, found their way inside. They lived under the same roof for a season while arrangements were made. They were not blood. He did not pursue eligible heiresses. She refused invitations from young gentlemen. Miss Charlotte Harrington began to appear in conversations with increasing frequency. A prosperous investor's daughter, charming and socially advantageous. "She would make you a brilliant alliance," Sophie remarked once, feigning indifference. Julian's reply was measured. "My decisions are not yours to consider." And yet, when Miss Harrington sent elaborate breakfasts and invitations, he did not accept them easily. Nor did he explain himself. Sophie told herself she imagined the glances, imagined the way he watched the street when she returned home, imagined the quiet violence in him whenever her name was spoken too freely by other men. But imagination cannot explain everything. One evening, beneath London fog, she said what she had sworn never to say again. "If I am merely your sister, then why do you follow me when I walk alone?" He froze. "You flatter yourself, and you lie." His composure fractured then. For one reckless moment he reached toward her, not to touch, but almost. "I protected you," he said hoarsely, "because no one else would." "That is not love," he added. The words were iron. She felt them close around her heart. London continued its glittering indifference. Balls were held, alliances formed. Edmund Whitmore's influence extended further into trade and property. But beneath the civility, tension thickened. Sophie sensed it. Julian did too. The past had not released them, and in Kent shadows still waited. The story had only just begun. Sophie had always believed that fear had a sound. In Kent, it was not a scream. It was the careful way a latch clicked too softly. The hush of servants pretending not to hear. The pause in conversation when Mr. Whitmore entered a room, smiling as though he brought comfort rather than control. The evening before her 18th birthday arrived with unsettling ceremony. The household was quieter than usual. Her mother had spent the day reclining with a handkerchief pressed to her lips, speaking of headaches and weakness, as if frailty itself were a shield against responsibility. Mr. Edmund Whitmore, meanwhile, was almost generous. He praised the cook. He complimented the roses arranged in the hall. He asked Sophie about her lessons in a tone that suggested affection, though his eyes never softened. At supper, he lifted his glass. "To Miss Ashford," he said smoothly, "a young lady of promising bloom." The words were harmless. The way he said them was not. Sophie kept her smile in place. Her fingers tightened around her napkin until the linen creased. Later, as the candles burned lower, her mother called her into the sitting room. Mrs. Margaret Ashford sat near the fire, her cheeks hollowed by weeks of illness and worry, or something that resembled illness. "Sophie," she began, in the voice she used when she wanted obedience to sound like love. "Yes, Mama?" Her mother's eyes flicked toward the corridor, then back. "You must be agreeable tonight." Sophie felt her spine stiffen. "I beg your pardon." Mrs. Ashford's breath caught, as though she were the one suffering. "Your stepfather has been under great strain," she whispered, "and you are of age tomorrow. A woman cannot remain a child forever." The room seemed to tilt slightly. Sophie tried to speak, but her mouth had gone dry. "You do not understand," her mother continued, clasping Sophie's hands with sudden desperation. "We cannot survive without him. The apothecary, the doctor, the debts, everything." "Mama," Sophie pulled her hands back. "What are you asking of me?" For a moment, Mrs. Ashford's face flickered with something like shame. Then fear swallowed it. "Do not anger him," she said quietly. "If he asks, you must say yes, just once, to calm him, to keep the house intact." Sophie stared. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind pressed against the window panes like a warning. Her mother's voice became a pleading hiss. "Your life is mine," she added, as if motherhood were ownership. "I gave you breath. You owe me peace." Sophie's nails dug into her own palm. In that instant she understood something she had been too young to name before. Her mother was not only afraid, she was trapped, and in her terror she was offering Sophie as payment. Before Sophie could answer, a servant appeared at the door. "Miss Ashford," the maid murmured, eyes lowered. "Mr. Whitmore requests you in his study." Sophie's heart stopped, then started again too quickly. Her mother leaned forward, grasping Sophie's sleeve. "Be good," she whispered. "Be quiet. Do not make it worse." Sophie rose on unsteady legs. She walked down the corridor as though she were moving underwater. Whitmore House seemed to close around her. In the study, Edmund Whitmore stood beside his desk, a decanter of brandy gleaming in candlelight. He looked at her the way a man looked at a locked chest he believed he had finally found the key to. "There you are," he said warmly. "My birthday girl." "It is tomorrow," Sophie replied, voice controlled with effort. He chuckled, as if she had made a charming joke. "Nonsense! You become a woman tonight, don't you?" He poured a drink he did not offer her. "I have a gift," he said, stepping closer. "Come, sit." Sophie did not sit. "I would like to return to my room," she said. His smile remained, but something sharp moved behind it. "Your mother will be at the physician's tomorrow," he said softly. "Do not trouble her with childish defiance." Sophie's throat tightened. "Please," she said, refusing to let the word become a sob. "I do not wish." Edmund's hand reached toward her wrist, not violent, not yet possessive. The candlelight trembled. Then the study door opened. A gust of cold air swept in with the intruder, as though the night itself had forced its way inside. Julian Whitmore stood in the threshold. He did not apologize for interrupting. He did not ask permission to enter. His gaze moved from Sophie to Edmund with quiet, lethal clarity. "Father," Julian said. Edmund's hand withdrew at once, as if he had been caught holding something dirty. "How dramatic!" Edmund scoffed, lifting his glass. "Must you always appear like a constable?" Julian stepped fully inside. He closed the door behind him, softly, deliberately. Sophie could not breathe. Julian's presence did not fill the room with warmth. It filled it with boundaries. "I require Sophie," Julian said, voice controlled. "There is a matter of her papers." Edmund laughed. "Her papers? At this hour?" Julian's expression did not change. "Yes." For a moment, Edmund Whitmore's eyes narrowed, measuring how far he could push without leaving marks the world would notice. Then his smile returned. He took a slow sip. "Very well," he said. "Take her then. Always rescuing, always noble." Julian did not respond. He moved to Sophie's side without looking at her too closely, as if even concern must be rationed. "Come," he said, and his hand hovered near her elbow. He did not touch. But Sophie felt the protection in the restraint itself. She followed him out of the study, down the corridor, past portraits of Whitmore ancestors who had built their respectability on secrets. Only when they reached the darkness of the library did Julian stop. The room smelled of old leather and dust, a sanctuary of silence. Sophie's hands began to tremble. She hated the trembling. She hated the weakness of it. Julian's voice was low. "Did he touch you?" Sophie swallowed. "No." The word was thin. It meant, "Not yet." Julian's jaw tightened so hard she thought his teeth might crack. "And your mother?" Sophie's eyes stung. "She said I must be agreeable," she whispered, "to keep him calm, to keep us safe." Julian's gaze snapped toward her, something raw, breaking through his composure. "Safe," he echoed, as if the word itself were an insult. He turned away, dragging a hand through his hair. For the first time, Sophie saw what he normally kept hidden. Not coldness, fury, a fury he had trained into discipline for years. "He will not have you," Julian said at last. Sophie's throat tightened. "You cannot stop him forever." Julian looked at her then. His eyes were dark, steady, and filled with a terrible tenderness he refused to name. "I can stop him tonight," he said, "and I can remove you tomorrow." Sophie's breath caught. "Remove me where?" "London," Julian replied. "Immediately. No debates. No delays." Sophie tried to gather her pride. "I am not a parcel." Julian's voice softened by a fraction. "Tonight, you are a target. Tomorrow, you will be 18, and the world will pretend you are suddenly safe because of a number." He stepped closer, still not touching. He lowered his voice. "You will leave this house." Sophie stared at him, anger and relief tangled together. "And you?" she demanded. "You will remain here with him?" Julian's gaze flickered. "Someone must," he said simply. Sophie's chest tightened. She thought of all the years he had stood between her and danger without asking for gratitude, of all the nights he had walked the corridors when the house sounded wrong, of all the things he had endured in silence. "What will you do?" she asked, "when I am gone?" Julian's mouth tightened. He seemed to choose his words like a man selecting weapons he hated using. "I will do what I have always done," he said. "I will survive him." Sophie's hands curled into fists. "And if he follows me to London?" Julian's eyes sharpened. "He will not." "How can you be sure?" Julian's voice lowered further, nearly a whisper. "Because if he tries," he said, "I will ruin him." The library felt colder. Sophie's heart beat wildly. She wanted to ask what that meant, what a son would do to destroy a father, what price Julian had already paid. But Julian turned away, as if even speaking the vow had cost him. "Pack only what you need," he said, "before dawn." Sophie swallowed. "And my mother?" Julian's face hardened again, the tenderness sealed away. "She will choose what she has always chosen," he said quietly, "and you will not be the sacrifice." The words should have comforted her. Instead, they broke something inside her, because beneath them was a truth she had tried not to admit. Julian had been fighting this battle alone for years. And Sophie had only just learned the name of it. Outside, the house slept like a beast, pretending innocence. Inside, Sophie returned to her room and began to pack. Each folded dress felt like a farewell. Each ribbon felt like a goodbye to the girl she had been. And when the first pale light crept through the curtains, Sophie understood something else too. This was not merely an escape, it was a severing. Because if she left, she might never return. And if Julian stayed, he might not survive the home that had made him so careful with his love that he could not even touch it. London did not greet her with kindness. It greeted her with fog. The carriage wheels rolled over damp cobblestones, just as the early morning bells began to ring, announcing a city already awake and indifferent. Sophie watched through the window as Kent dissolved into memory, replaced by rows of brick townhouses and soot-stained facades that seemed to lean inward as though conspiring. She had imagined freedom would feel lighter. Instead, it felt unfamiliar. The residence Julian had arranged stood in Bloomsbury, modest yet respectable, tucked between a bookseller's shop and a narrow apothecary. Officially, she was placed under the distant guardianship of a widowed acquaintance of the Whitmores, Mrs. Ellington, who agreed, under certain financial encouragement, to lend her name to propriety. In truth, Julian funded everything. The drawing room was small but tasteful. Pale blue wallpaper, a pianoforte near the window, curtains trimmed in understated lace, nothing extravagant, nothing scandalous, nothing that could invite speculation. "You will remain discreet," Julian said that first afternoon, as he stood by the hearth, gloves still on. "London tolerates many sins, Miss Ashford, but it never forgives impropriety in a woman." Sophie removed her bonnet slowly. "I have no intention of behaving improperly." His gaze met hers briefly. "That is rarely sufficient." He spoke not as a brother, not as a suitor, but as a strategist, as a man calculating dangers she could not yet see. She crossed the room, allowing herself to inspect the shelves of books arranged with deliberate care. "You have chosen well," she said quietly. "I chose safely," he corrected. There was a difference. In Kent, silence had felt suffocating. In Bloomsbury, it felt charged. They were alone in a city of millions, and yet every movement required caution. Julian would not remain under the same roof beyond what was absolutely necessary. The arrangement would last only until her official sponsorship was properly established. Even so, for a handful of weeks, they occupied neighboring chambers. Doors remained slightly ajar during conversation. Footsteps were measured. Servants were instructed to remain visible. Julian's restraint was meticulous. If Sophie had not known him so well, she might have mistaken it for indifference. The second evening in London, rain swept through the streets like a curtain drawn across the world. Sophie stood by the window, watching droplets race one another down the glass. "You dislike it already," Julian observed from across the room. "I dislike being transported as though I were cargo," she replied. He removed his gloves carefully, setting them on the table. "You were in danger." "I am not fragile." He studied her. "No," he agreed. "You are not." Something flickered in his expression, pride perhaps, or something deeper he refused to indulge. "But fragility is irrelevant," he continued. "Reputation is not built on strength. It is built on perception." She turned to face him fully. "And how am I perceived?" "As my sister." The word landed with precision. Sophie felt her chest tighten. "You insist upon it so often," she said quietly. "One would think you feared the alternative." His gaze sharpened. "I fear the consequences." She stepped closer. "Of affection, of ruin." The word echoed. London was not Kent. Here, whispers moved faster than carriages. A single rumour could unravel carefully constructed futures, and there were already eyes upon them. Mrs. Ellington received callers the following week, women of gentle breeding, men of polite curiosity. They assessed Sophie's dress, her manner, her lineage. They assessed Julian too. A young gentleman, educated, disciplined, heir to property and investment, a man of promise, and promise attracted interest. Miss Charlotte Harrington's name surfaced almost immediately. Her father, a prosperous investor with connections in shipping and architecture, had taken notice of Julian's ambitions. An alliance would be mutually advantageous. "She is charming," Mrs. Ellington remarked one afternoon. "And wealthy." Julian's reply was neutral. "Wealth does not guarantee compatibility." Sophie pretended not to listen, but later that evening, when she found herself alone in the library with him, the subject rose unbidden. "You ought to meet her," she said, feigning lightness. "Miss Harrington." He did not look up from the correspondence in his hand. "I will meet whom I must." "And marry whom you must?" His hand stilled. "You concern yourself unnecessarily." She smiled faintly. "I am your sister. Is that not my duty?" The silence that followed felt brittle. Finally, he set the letter aside. "Sophie," he said carefully, "you will not mock this arrangement." "I am not mocking." Her voice trembled despite her effort. "I am acknowledging what you have chosen." "I have chosen nothing," he said sharply. "Yet?" The air shifted between them. Julian rose slowly, crossing the room until only a breath separated them. "You believe I am ambitious," he said. "Aren't you?" "Yes." He did not deny it, "but not at the expense of what is mine to protect." Her pulse quickened. "And what is that?" His gaze lowered to her face. For a moment, just one, he forgot himself. "You," he said. The word was nearly a confession, but he caught it before it became one. "You are under my responsibility." The correction was swift. Sophie stepped back. "You make it sound like a burden." His jaw tightened. "It is not." "Then what is it?" Julian did not answer. Because there were words he could not permit himself to speak. In the weeks that followed, London society began its quiet scrutiny. Sophie received invitations to small gatherings, literary salons, afternoon teas, concert evenings where conversation was as important as music. Julian attended some events alone. Others, he escorted her formally, offering his arm with impeccable decorum, always careful, always distant. But Sophie noticed things. The way his attention sharpened when a gentleman lingered too long at her side. The way his posture stiffened when laughter sounded too intimate. The way he positioned himself subtly between her and the more aggressive members of society. One evening, as she returned from a music recital slightly later than planned, she sensed it. Footsteps behind her, measured, consistent. She did not turn immediately. She waited until she reached the lamplight outside Bloomsbury. Then she faced the street. Julian emerged from shadow. She was not surprised. "You follow me," she said softly. "I ensure your safety. I was with Mrs. Ellington, and now you are not." Rain misted faintly in the air. "Do you follow Miss Harrington as well?" she asked. His expression cooled. "This is not a jest, nor is my question." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I follow you because London does not forgive carelessness." "And because?" she pressed. His hand lifted slightly, then stilled before touching her shoulder. The restraint trembled between them. "And because no one else will protect you properly." The words carried weight. "And you call that not love?" she whispered. Julian's gaze darkened. "What you imagine," he said, "would destroy you." "And what you feel?" she asked. His breath caught. For a moment the city seemed to disappear. Then his composure returned like armor sliding back into place. "I feel responsibility," he said firmly. The lie settled between them like winter frost. Sophie turned toward the house. "And I," she replied quietly, "feel something you refuse to name." Inside, doors closed gently, footsteps faded. But something irreversible had shifted. London was watching. Society was calculating. Miss Harrington's interest was growing. And beneath Julian Whitmore's discipline, love was taking root so deeply that he feared even the smallest touch might expose it. The danger in Kent had been obvious. The danger in London wore silk gloves. And Sophie was beginning to understand that the greatest threat was not Edmund Whitmore. It was the feeling Julian believed he must never allow himself to hold. London in the spring possessed a particular cruelty. It disguised calculation as elegance. Carriages gleamed, silk rustled like polite applause, and every introduction carried the weight of negotiation. By April, Sophie understood that her presence in Bloomsbury was no longer invisible. She had been received in several respectable homes. Her manners were praised. Her lineage, though modest, was deemed tolerable. Most importantly, she was considered harmless. Harmless young women did not threaten alliances, but Julian did. He had begun to attract attention beyond what even he could moderate. His architectural proposals, precise, innovative, daring without arrogance, had impressed a circle of investors seeking fresh minds. Among them was Mr. Harrington, a man who measured affection in percentages. It was at the Harrington soiree that Sophie first observed the machinery of society at work. The Harrington residence in Mayfair glowed with candlelight and expectation. Crystal chandeliers fractured illumination into shards of brilliance that caught upon every polished surface. The air smelled faintly of roses and ambition. Julian offered Sophie his arm. His grip was firm, measured, public. Inside, Miss Charlotte Harrington stood near the pianoforte, a vision of cultivated charm. She was not excessively beautiful, but she possessed that invaluable quality, confidence born of security. Her smile was effortless, her gown the softest shade of ivory. "Mr. Whitmore," she greeted warmly, "how delighted I am that you have come." Julian bowed. "Miss Harrington, and this must be your sister." The word landed with almost imperceptible emphasis. Sophie inclined her head. "Miss Ashford," she corrected gently. Miss Harrington's eyes flickered, just slightly. "Of course. Not blood. Not quite sister. Interesting." The evening unfolded in layers. Music, conversation, strategic laughter. Sophie observed more than she spoke. Mr. Harrington drew Julian aside for discussions of contracts and commissions. Miss Harrington drifted near them with graceful inevitability, ensuring proximity without appearing intrusive. Sophie did not miss the choreography, nor did she miss Julian's restraint. He listened attentively, responded intelligently, maintained polite distance. But when Miss Harrington's gloved fingers brushed his sleeve in animated emphasis, Julian's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. Later, in the conservatory where greenery softened ambition into romance, Miss Harrington approached Sophie directly. "You must find London exhilarating," she said sweetly. "I find it instructive," Sophie replied. Charlotte smiled. "You are fortunate, Miss Ashford. Few young ladies are afforded such attentive guardianship." There it was. The test. Sophie met her gaze calmly. "My stepbrother has always been conscientious." "How admirable," Charlotte murmured. "Such devotion is rare." "And advantageous," Sophie added lightly. Charlotte's smile widened by a fraction. "You are perceptive." They stood amid ferns and candlelight, two young women bound not by hostility but by awareness. Charlotte Harrington did not dislike Sophie. She simply recognized her as a complication. Across the room, Julian's eyes found Sophie, only for a second. But the look was unmistakable. He was assessing, ensuring she was untroubled. The sight tightened something in Charlotte's expression. Later that evening, as carriages lined the street outside and guests prepared to depart, Mr. Harrington made his intentions clear. "Whitmore," he said jovially, "we must speak soon about a more permanent association." Julian understood the implication. "I would welcome further discussion," he replied carefully. Sophie's chest felt strangely hollow. Permanent association. It sounded so dignified, so civilized. She did not speak during the carriage ride home. Julian noticed. "You are unusually quiet," he remarked. "I was thinking." "That can be dangerous." A faint smile ghosted her lips. "Will you accept his offer?" "Which offer?" "The one implied." He exhaled slowly. "Nothing has been offered formally, but it will be." "Yes." Silence settled again. The carriage wheels turned steadily over cobblestones. "And will you?" she pressed. Julian's gaze remained forward. "My career depends upon prudent alliances." "And your heart?" she asked before she could stop herself. His jaw tightened. "My heart," he said evenly, "has no jurisdiction here." The answer struck her harder than she expected. By the following week, invitations from the Harringtons increased in frequency. Julian attended twice. The third time, he declined. Miss Harrington, unaccustomed to refusal, appeared at Bloomsbury under the pretence of returning a book. Sophie received her in the drawing room. Charlotte's poise did not waver. "I hope you do not find me forward," she said lightly. "But London thrives on clarity." Sophie folded her hands neatly in her lap. "Clarity is a virtue." Charlotte regarded her thoughtfully. "You are not his sister," she said plainly. Sophie did not flinch. "No." "Yet society believes you are." "Yes." Charlotte stepped closer to the window, her reflection caught in the glass. "Affection under such circumstances invites speculation." Sophie understood the warning. "Speculation requires evidence." Charlotte's gaze returned to her. "Or imagination." They studied one another. "You care for him," Charlotte observed quietly. The room seemed to still. Sophie could have lied, should have lied. Instead, she chose dignity. "I care that he succeeds," she replied. Charlotte nodded slowly. "And I intend to ensure he does." The meaning was clear. Charlotte Harrington offered security, influence, respectability, everything Julian's ambitions required, everything Sophie's presence endangered. When Julian returned that evening and learned of Charlotte's visit, his composure fractured, only slightly. "She had no right," he said sharply. "She has every right," Sophie countered. "You have encouraged her. I have encouraged business. And she," Sophie said quietly, "believes she is business." Julian ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration he rarely allowed himself. "You imagine threats where none exist." "Do I?" Her voice softened. "If you marry her, Julian, London will applaud. And if I do not, London will ask why." He looked at her then, truly looked. The candlelight caught in his eyes, revealing conflict he usually masked. "Would you prefer I accept?" he asked. The question was unfair. She forced steadiness into her voice. "I prefer you do what is wise." "And wisdom demands what?" "Distance," she whispered. The word hovered between them like a blade. Julian stepped toward her, close enough that the warmth of him unsettled her breath. "Distance," he repeated softly. "Yes." He studied her face as though memorizing it. "You think this will solve anything?" "I think," she said, her voice trembling despite her resolve, "that if you marry her, the world will stop watching us." His hand lifted again, hovered near her cheek. Stopped. Always stopped. "And if the world is not what concerns me?" he asked quietly. Her pulse raced. "Then what does?" His throat tightened. For one reckless second, she thought he might answer honestly. But Julian Whitmore had built his life upon restraint. "What concerns me," he said finally, "is that you remain unblemished by scandal." "And you?" she asked. "I am already beyond saving." The admission startled her. "Do not say that." "It is true." His gaze darkened. "You do not know what I have done to ensure you left Kent." The weight of those words lingered. She sensed danger beneath them, danger he would not yet explain. Outside, London glittered. Inside, something trembled. Miss Charlotte Harrington offered certainty. Julian offered protection, and Sophie stood between them, realizing that love in a world ruled by perception was not a matter of confession, it was a matter of sacrifice, and someone soon would be required to make it. There are truths that announce themselves boldly, and there are truths that wait inside drawers. Sophie found the latter on an afternoon when London was drenched in unseasonable rain. Mrs. Ellington had gone to visit a cousin in Kensington. The servants moved softly through the house. The fire burned low, and Bloomsbury felt suspended between breaths. Julian had left earlier that morning for a meeting in the city. He had seemed distracted, tense, as though a decision pressed upon him that he could neither accept nor refuse. Sophie told herself she would not wander into his study. She told herself that respect was the only dignity she had left. But curiosity, once sharpened by silence, becomes its own kind of hunger. The study door was not locked. It rarely was. Julian trusted in order more than in barriers. She stepped inside with hesitation. The room smelled faintly of ink and tobacco, disciplined habits neatly contained. His desk was immaculate, correspondence sorted. Documents aligned, nothing betrayed disorder, nothing except a small wooden box tucked into the back of the lowest drawer. She did not intend to open it. At least she believed she did not. But her fingers moved with treacherous autonomy. The lid lifted easily. Inside lay a bundle of folded papers tied with a dark ribbon. Her name was written on the top one, not Miss Ashford, not Sister, simply Sophie. Her breath faltered. The ink was familiar. Julian's hand, measured, precise. She unfolded the first letter. It was dated 3 years prior, before London, before Kent had become unbearable. I cannot permit you to see what this house is becoming. You deserve a future untouched by it. The words were not florid, not romantic, but they trembled with something dangerously close to tenderness. She read on. I have considered sending you away sooner, yet each time I attempt it, I find myself reluctant. Reluctance is weakness. Weakness is a luxury I cannot afford. Her hands shook. There were more letters, each written, none sent, each one a confession disguised as strategy. I followed you today to the village green. Not because I distrust you, because I distrust every man who looks at you as though he has discovered something he intends to claim. Another. You smiled at supper tonight? I should not have noticed. I should not remember it. And another. When you speak of leaving Kent, I encourage you. When I imagine you gone, I cannot breathe. Sophie pressed the paper to her chest as if it might steady her pulse. All these years. He had been fighting himself. The final letter was the most recent, dated the night before she left Kent. You think I am cold. You must continue thinking so. If you knew how close I come to touching you, you would despise me. I will not allow myself that indulgence. If you remain, I will fail you. If you leave, I will lose you. I choose your safety over my own comfort. He had signed it only, J. The door behind her clicked softly. She did not hear it at first, not until his voice cut through the room. You had no right. Sophie turned slowly. Julian stood in the threshold. His composure was intact. His eyes were not. You follow me, she said faintly, and you trespass. She held up the letters. These were never meant to be found, he said quietly. They were never meant to be written, she replied. Silence thickened between them. He crossed the room in 3 measured strides and removed the bundle from her hands. His fingers brushed hers briefly. It was the smallest touch. It felt catastrophic. You misinterpret private reflection, he said, though the words lacked conviction. I misinterpret nothing, she answered. He placed the letters back into the box with rigid precision. They change nothing. They change everything. Julian exhaled sharply. They change nothing, he repeated. You are still under my protection. I am still... My brother? She interrupted. The word fractured. His jaw tightened. Yes. You are not my brother, she said. To the world I am. And when have you ever lived for the world? She demanded. The question struck deeper than she intended. His restraint began to fray. You believe feeling absolves consequence, he said, voice low. It does not. Then tell me what you feel, she insisted. He stepped back as if the request itself were fire. What I feel is irrelevant. It is not irrelevant to me. That is precisely why it must remain unspoken. Her throat tightened. You would deny it entirely? I would bury it, he corrected. The room felt suddenly too small. The rain against the window sounded like applause for tragedy. You think marriage to Miss Harrington will bury it? She asked. His gaze flickered. "This has nothing to do with her." "It has everything to do with her." He did not deny it, because the truth had become visible. Charlotte Harrington was not merely opportunity, she was escape, respectability, distance, a solution. "If I accept her father's proposal," Julian said carefully, "the speculation will end, and so will we." "There is no we," he said too quickly. The lie hung between them, fragile and transparent. Sophie stepped closer. "So the letters are imagination," she said softly. "The following me in Kent was imagination. The fury in the orchard was imagination." "You imagine what you wish," he replied. "And you suppress what you know." For a moment something raw and unguarded surfaced in his expression. Not desire, not weakness, pain. "You do not understand the danger," he said. "Then explain it." He hesitated, because to explain it would be to expose Edmund, to expose the lengths he had already gone. "I secured your removal from Kent at cost," he said finally. "What cost?" He looked away. "Do not ask." "Was it money?" Silence. "Was it reputation?" Silence. Her heart began to pound. "And what did you do?" His voice dropped lower. "I ensured father would hesitate before ever approaching you again." The implication chilled her. "You threatened him?" "Yes. And I possess proof of matters that would ruin him if exposed." Her breath caught. "Proof of what?" Julian's eyes darkened. "Of transactions that are not lawful." Sophie stared. "You would destroy him. I would destroy anyone who endangered you." The words were not spoken with drama. They were spoken with certainty, and certainty frightened her more than anger ever could. "You carry all this alone," she whispered. He did not respond, because the answer was evident. She reached for him then, not boldly, not recklessly, just enough for her fingers to graze his sleeve. He went utterly still. "You love me," she said. The room felt suspended in time. Julian's hand lifted. For one unbearable second it hovered near her waist, near enough that warmth met warmth. Then he closed his fingers into a fist. "I will not touch you," he said hoarsely. The confession was more intimate than any embrace. "I cannot." "Because it is wrong?" she asked. "Because it would destroy you," he replied. "And if I choose it?" "You do not understand what choice costs a woman." Her eyes stung. "I am not a child." "No," he said softly. "You are precisely why I must remain a man." The words shattered something inside her. Outside, the rain ceased. Inside, the silence grew heavier. Julian stepped away first, always first. "I will attend Mr. Harrington tomorrow," he said evenly. The decision landed like a verdict. "And if he offers his daughter's hand?" "I will consider it." "Consider?" she echoed faintly. He did not look back as he left the study. The door closed with unbearable gentleness. Sophie remained alone with the echo of letters that had never been sent. Now she understood. He had loved her quietly, deeply, painfully. But in a society that punished impropriety more severely than cruelty, love without legitimacy was a weapon, and Julian Whitmore would sooner wound himself than risk wounding her. What she did not yet know was that London had already begun whispering, and whispers once started do not stop merely because two hearts choose restraint. London does not accuse, it suggests, it does not confront, it observes, and once it observes long enough, it concludes. The morning after Sophie discovered the letters, Bloomsbury felt altered, though nothing visible had changed. The furniture remained in its careful arrangement. The curtains still filtered pale light into the drawing room. The servants moved as they always had. Only the air had shifted. Julian departed early for his meeting with Mr. Harrington. He did not seek Sophie before leaving. He did not explain what he intended to say. He did not look toward the study. And she, in equal measure of pride and injury, did not watch from the window. Instead, she attended a small literary gathering that afternoon, determined to behave precisely as society required. The salon was hosted by Mrs. Lytton, a widow who prided herself on cultivating progressive conversation without ever disturbing propriety. The room shimmered with polished voices and subtle competition. Sophie had attended twice before. This time, she felt examined. Conversations lowered when she entered, not overtly, but enough. Miss Caroline Avery, a young woman with an appetite for rumor disguised as curiosity, approached her with unusual warmth. "Miss Ashford," she said brightly, "how fortunate you are to have such devoted family." Sophie smiled politely. "I am fortunate in many respects." Caroline tilted her head. "Your stepbrother escorts you everywhere, does he not?" "Not everywhere, but frequently, as is appropriate." Caroline's smile sharpened. "Of course, it must be comforting to have a gentleman so attentive." Sophie felt the tremor beneath the compliment. "It is comforting to have one's welfare considered." "Indeed." A pause. "And yet," Caroline continued lightly, "one hears peculiar things in London." Sophie held her composure. "London hears many peculiar things." Caroline leaned closer. "That you reside under the same roof, that you are not related by blood, that Mr. Whitmore has declined several invitations where eligible young ladies were present." Each statement fell like a carefully placed stone. Sophie kept her voice calm. "Proximity does not imply impropriety." "No," Caroline agreed softly. "But imagination does not require proof." The remark lingered. By the time Sophie returned to Bloomsbury, she understood the shape of the danger. It was not dramatic, it was incremental. A question here, a raised brow there, a pattern constructed from coincidence. Julian returned at dusk. His expression was unreadable. Sophie met him in the drawing room, her posture composed. "How did your meeting proceed?" she asked. "It proceeded," he replied. "And Mr. Harrington is inclined toward formal discussion." Her stomach tightened. "With his daughter." "Yes." The word settled between them. "And you?" she asked. Julian removed his gloves slowly, as though each motion required deliberation. "I have not accepted." Relief flickered before she could suppress it. "But you have not refused." "No." He studied her. "You were observed today." She stiffened. "Observed?" "At Mrs. Lytton's gathering." "How do you know?" "I was informed." "By whom?" He did not answer, because Julian Whitmore did not reveal his sources. "What was said?" she pressed. "That you appear attached." The word was delivered without emphasis. It cut nonetheless. "And what did you reply?" "That attachment is natural between siblings." She felt heat rise to her face. "Siblings," she repeated quietly. "It is the only narrative that protects you." "And you?" He exhaled slowly. "I am less vulnerable." She laughed softly. "You are naive if you believe that." Julian's gaze sharpened. "My reputation is resilient. Your father's is not." At the mention of Edmund, tension returned instantly. "You will not bring Kent into this," Julian said quietly. "It never left," she replied. Silence descended again. He stepped closer. "London does not forgive women," he said. "Men recover. Women do not." "I am aware." "Then you understand why this must end." The finality in his tone unsettled her. "What must end?" "This arrangement." She stared at him. "You are sending me away again." "I am sending you somewhere less scrutinized." "Where?" "Bath, under more distant supervision." Her chest tightened. "You believe distance will silence gossip?" "It will." "And what of you?" He hesitated. "I will remain." "With Miss Harrington." The implication hovered unspoken. Julian's jaw tightened. "If I formalize an understanding, speculation will cease. You will sacrifice yourself for optics. I will sacrifice preference for stability. She stepped toward him. Do not call it preference. He looked at her fully now. The restraint in his expression wavered. Then what would you call it? She swallowed. Truth. The word trembled between them. Before he could respond, a knock sounded at the door. A servant entered, pale. Mr. Whitmore, he said quietly, there is a gentleman requesting immediate audience. Julian's eyes narrowed. Name? Mr. Edmund Whitmore. The room seemed to still. Sophie felt the past rush into the present with brutal clarity. He cannot be here, she whispered. Julian's posture shifted instantly, protective, controlled, lethal. He can, Julian replied. He should not. Edmund Whitmore entered Bloomsbury as though he owned it. Elegant, impeccably dressed, smiling. My children, he greeted smoothly. Sophie's stomach turned. Julian did not bow. You were not invited, Julian said evenly. I rarely require invitation. Edmund's gaze moved to Sophie. 18 suits you. She felt the old chill crawl along her spine. What brings you to London? Julian asked. Concern, Edmund replied. The city is unkind to naive arrangements. Julian's expression hardened. Speak plainly. Edmund folded his gloves neatly. Rumors circulate, he said lightly. About proximity, about impropriety, about a young lady who does not understand boundaries. Sophie felt humiliation burn beneath her skin. You dare, Julian began. I dare to protect the Whitmore name, Edmund interrupted calmly. Unless, of course, you intend to abandon it. The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. If this continues, Edmund added softly, I may be forced to intervene. Intervene how? Julian asked. Edmund's eyes gleamed faintly. With disclosure. Silence fell heavy. Julian stepped forward. You will not threaten her. I threaten nothing, Edmund replied. I merely remind you that society is merciless. His gaze flicked to Sophie once more. Perhaps a marriage would silence such unpleasantness. The suggestion hung in the air like poison. When Edmund finally departed, the door closing with infuriating gentleness, Sophie felt as though the walls themselves had shifted. Julian remained still for a long moment. Then, what did you give him? She asked quietly. His shoulders stiffened. Nothing. He would not come merely to observe. Julian did not respond, because he had already anticipated this move. He turned toward her slowly. We leave London, he said. You cannot outrun rumour. I can redirect it. She studied his face. You are afraid. He met her gaze. Yes, not for himself, for her. Then let us confront it, she said softly. Julian shook his head. You do not understand the scale of this. Then explain it. His voice lowered. If father chooses to expose certain ambiguities, society will not ask whether they are true. They will assume, and you will pay. The truth settled like winter frost. Sophie understood then. The greatest threat was not scandal itself. It was Edmund's willingness to wield it. Julian's love had always been disciplined. Now it was cornered. And a cornered man, however restrained, was capable of decisions that could unravel everything. London was no longer watching idly. It was waiting, and the next move would not belong to gossip. It would belong to sacrifice. London, when threatened with scandal, does not erupt. It tightens. Invitations grow fewer, glances linger longer. Doors remain open just a little wider than necessary. After Edmund Whitmore's visit, Bloomsbury felt like a house under quiet surveillance. Julian did not say so. He did not need to. Sophie sensed it in the way he altered their routines. Calls were reduced. Evenings out became rare. Servants were dismissed earlier than usual, as though silence itself could protect them. You cannot guard against air, she told him one morning. I can guard against men, he replied. She watched him across the breakfast table. He had not slept. She could see it in the faint shadow beneath his eyes. "What did he want?" she asked again. "You heard him. That was not all." Julian set down his teacup carefully. "He believes pressure will force compliance." "And will it?" He met her gaze steadily. "No." She wished she could believe that firmness alone could repel danger. But Edmund was not a man who retreated when refused. By midweek a letter arrived bearing the Whitmore seal. Julian read it alone in the study. When he emerged, his composure was intact. Too intact. "He is hosting a dinner," Julian said. Sophie's stomach tightened. "In London?" "Yes, and we are invited." "Summoned," he corrected. She rose slowly from her chair. "You will not go." "I must." "And I?" He hesitated. "You will remain here." She stepped toward him. "He will interpret that as weakness. He will interpret anything as weakness." "Then let him see we are not afraid." Julian's jaw tightened. "Bravery is admirable," he said quietly. "Foolishness is not. And which am I?" He softened, just slightly. "You are neither, but he knows precisely where to strike." She understood. Edmund did not attack openly, he destabilized. The dinner was held at a rented townhouse near Grosvenor Square, ostentatious without warmth. Candles blazed, laughter echoed. Society gathered as though nothing sinister underlay the invitation. Sophie insisted upon attending. Julian did not forbid her, but the tension in his posture as he escorted her inside betrayed his reluctance. Edmund greeted them as though they had arrived for a family celebration. "My dear children," he said smoothly, "how fortunate that London affords us reunion." Julian bowed stiffly. Sophie inclined her head without warmth. The table glittered with silver and crystal. Miss Charlotte Harrington was present, seated near Edmund with conspicuous prominence. So was her father. The arrangement was not subtle. Dinner unfolded with strategic civility. Edmund spoke of investments, of expansion, of architectural commissions that would require reliable partners. Mr. Harrington listened with growing interest. Julian answered when addressed. Briefly, precisely. Sophie felt the undercurrent. Every word was calculated to position Julian as indispensable and compromised. At last Edmund lifted his glass. "To family," he said. The word felt grotesque. "To loyalty." His gaze flicked toward Sophie. "To clarity." A murmur of approval circled the table. Charlotte's smile did not waver. After dessert, Edmund requested a private conversation with Julian in the adjoining library. Sophie's heart began to pound. "You will not be long?" she asked quietly. Julian's eyes met hers. "No." He followed his father. The door closed. Charlotte approached Sophie soon after. "You look pale," she observed gently. "The room is warm." Charlotte studied her thoughtfully. "My father believes this alliance would benefit everyone," she said. "Everyone? You, Mr. Whitmore." "Myself." Sophie kept her voice steady. "An alliance is not affection." Charlotte tilted her head. "Affection grows." "Does it?" Sophie asked. Charlotte's expression softened slightly. "You underestimate the value of security, and you underestimate the cost of sacrifice." Charlotte did not respond. Inside the library, voices rose, muffled but heated. Sophie strained to hear. A chair scraped sharply. The door opened. Julian emerged first. His expression was rigid. Edmund followed more leisurely. "Well," Edmund said lightly, "it appears we are in agreement." Sophie's pulse faltered. "Agreement?" she repeated faintly. Julian did not look at her immediately. "The Harrington proposal will be considered formally," he said. Considered. The word felt like a verdict, dressed in restraint. Charlotte's eyes brightened almost imperceptibly. Edmund smiled with satisfaction that bordered on triumph. The remainder of the evening blurred for Sophie. When they finally returned to Bloomsbury, the silence between her and Julian was unbearable. In the drawing room, Beneath the dim glow of a single lamp, she turned to him. What did he threaten? Julian removed his gloves slowly. He implied exposure. Of what? Of impropriety. There is none. That is irrelevant. Her breath quickened. He would lie. He would insinuate. And you believe marriage will silence him. It will remove motive. She stepped closer. And what of us? There is no us, he repeated, though the words lacked conviction. You accepted. I agreed to consider. You agreed, she said, his composure cracked. For your protection. For your ambition, she countered. For both, he said sharply. She felt tears threaten but forced them back. You think I require saving from feeling. I know you require saving from ruin. And you? She whispered. Who saves you? The question hung unanswered. He looked at her then, not as guardian, not as strategist, as a man at war with himself. I will endure it, he said quietly. You will marry her. If necessary. Her heart seemed to splinter. You would condemn yourself to a life without love. Julian's gaze darkened. You assume I have a choice. You do. No, he replied softly. You do not see the scale of consequence. He stepped closer, closer than propriety allowed. For one trembling second, his hand reached for her. Stopped, always stopped. If I choose you, he said hoarsely, you will be destroyed. And if you choose her, I will. The confession was raw, not theatrical, simply true. Silence swallowed the room. Sophie understood then. He was not choosing Charlotte out of ambition. He was choosing her out of fear, fear of what Edmund could reveal, fear of whispers becoming verdict, fear that the letters she had found might one day be read aloud in a room full of polite cruelty. Then I will leave, she said suddenly. Julian's head snapped up. No! If my presence endangers you, it is not your presence, he interrupted. It is what I feel in it. The admission shook them both. She stepped back. You cannot protect me by erasing yourself, and you cannot save me by remaining. The impasse felt absolute. Outside, London carried on, oblivious and watchful all at once. Inside, two hearts stood at the edge of a decision neither wished to make. Julian turned away first. He always did. Nothing is settled, he said quietly. But Sophie knew better. Something had been set in motion that evening, not by love, not by ambition, but by coercion. And when protection begins to resemble surrender, sacrifice ceases to feel noble. It begins to feel inevitable. It was Sophie who began the withdrawal, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with the quiet precision of a woman who understands that love, when cornered, must either harden or break. The morning after the dinner at Grosvenor Square, she rose earlier than usual. The house was still. Pale light stretched across the floorboards like a fragile promise. Julian had fallen asleep in the study. She knew because the lamp had burned long into the night. For a moment, she stood in the doorway and watched him. Even in sleep, he seemed restrained. As if even his dreams required discipline. She wanted to wake him, to say something reckless, something that would shatter restraint entirely. Instead, she turned away. That afternoon, she sent a letter, not to Edmund, not to Charlotte, but to Mrs. Ellington's cousin in Bath. A polite inquiry, an interest in assisting with charitable administration, a possibility of relocation. When Julian learned of it, it was not from her. It was from the servant who had been instructed to dispatch the note. He found her in the small back garden of Bloomsbury, where climbing ivy pressed against brick as though seeking escape. You are leaving, he said. It was not a question. Sophie did not turn immediately. I am considering it. You did not consult me. I am not a parcel, she replied quietly. His jaw tightened at the echo of her earlier words. Bath is not protection, he said. It is distance. Distance from what? She faced him then. From speculation. He stepped closer. You think removing yourself will silence rumor? It will remove fuel. His expression darkened. You are not fuel. In London I am. Silence stretched between them. I will not permit this, he said. She almost smiled. You cannot forbid me without confirming every suspicion. He flinched slightly. She had struck accurately. You are angry, he said. Yes. At me. Yes. Then punish me, he replied sharply. Do not punish yourself. Her composure faltered for the first time. You believe this is punishment? She asked. It is exile. It is survival. Julian stepped so near she could feel his breath. You leave because you believe I will marry her. I leave because you believe you must. The truth landed heavily. They stood in the narrow garden, hemmed in by brick and propriety. If I refuse Charlotte, he said quietly, Father will escalate. And if you accept her, Father will retreat. And you, she asked, I will endure. She closed her eyes briefly. Stop calling it endurance, she whispered. Call it what it is. And what is that? Loss. The word trembled between them. He reached for her again, stopped again. Do not go, he said. It was the closest he had come to pleading. Sophie's resolve wavered. Then choose differently, she replied. His silence answered for him. The reply from Bath arrived swiftly. Mrs. Ellington's cousin welcomed assistance. Accommodation would be arranged. The departure could be within a fortnight. When Miss Charlotte Harrington visited again, her manner had shifted. Less guarded, more assured. I understand congratulations may soon be in order, she said gently, as she and Sophie sat in the drawing room. For whom? Sophie asked evenly. For all of us. Charlotte's gaze lingered. I know you care for him, she said without hostility. And you? I respect him. That is not the same. No, Charlotte admitted. But respect lasts. Sophie's fingers tightened in her lap. And what of affection? Charlotte's smile was composed. Affection can be cultivated. Sophie almost pitied her. You deserve more than cultivation, she said softly. And you deserve safety, Charlotte replied. The exchange felt less like rivalry and more like recognition. When Charlotte departed, Sophie stood at the window, watching the carriage disappear into London's ordered chaos. Julian entered moments later. She came to see you, he observed. Yes. And? She believes she will have you. His expression hardened. She believes what society teaches her. And what do you believe? He did not answer. Because belief, when named, becomes responsibility. That evening, they dined in silence. No argument, no accusation. Just the heavy awareness that time was narrowing. 2 days before her planned departure, Edmund sent another letter. Short, precise. You will do what preserves the Whitmore name. Julian burned it without comment. Sophie watched the paper curl into ash. He will not stop, she said quietly. No, then this is mercy, she replied. For whom? He asked. For you. He turned toward her sharply. You presume to decide my mercy? She held his gaze. You have decided mine for years. The words landed with painful accuracy. The final night in Bloomsbury arrived without ceremony. No raised voices, no dramatic confessions. Sophie packed carefully, folding each gown as though she were closing chapters rather than trunks. Julian stood in the doorway watching. You may still refuse, she said softly. He did not move. And if I do, I remain. And if I remain, she swallowed. You risk everything. He stepped into the room. The distance between them felt unbearable. I have already risked everything, he said quietly. For you. The confession was no longer hidden. It hovered openly between them. Then let me risk something for you, she replied. His hand lifted once more. This time it did not stop immediately. It hovered near her cheek, trembling with restraint. "You think distance will cure this," he murmured. "No," she whispered, "but it may protect it." His breath caught. "Protect what?" "What you refused to touch." The silence that followed felt sacred and devastating. At last he withdrew his hand. He always withdrew. "I will see you to Bath," he said. "You should not." "I will." She nodded. "Because some goodbyes require witnesses." Outside, London slept in calculated innocence. Inside, two hearts prepared for separation, not because love had faded, but because love, in a world ruled by perception and power, had become too dangerous to remain unguarded. And sometimes, the deepest affection is not the one declared. It is the one that chooses distance rather than destruction. Bath did not resemble exile, it resembled gentility, its pale stone terraces curved with deliberate grace, as though the city itself had been designed to soothe wounded reputations. Visitors strolled along the Royal Crescent. Ladies discussed ailments and novels. Gentlemen admired the view and pretended to admire nothing else. It was the perfect place for a young woman who required removal without disgrace. Sophie arrived in early autumn. Julian accompanied her as promised. The journey was restrained, polite, painfully careful. They spoke of practicalities, lodgings, introductions, schedules. They did not speak of letters or London or Charlotte Harrington. At the entrance to her new residence, a respectable townhouse overlooking a narrow square, Julian paused. "This will suffice," he said quietly. Sophie nodded. "Yes." The word felt smaller than the life she was leaving behind. Inside, the rooms were modest but warm. Mrs. Ellington's cousin, Mrs. Davenport, welcomed her with gentle curiosity. "You shall find Bath kinder than London," she assured. Sophie wondered whether kindness was merely indifference, dressed in softer fabric. When Julian prepared to depart the following morning, the silence between them was almost unbearable. "You will write?" she asked. "Yes." "Formally?" "Yes." She managed a faint smile. "As a brother?" His jaw tightened. "As propriety demands." She held his gaze. "And what propriety does not demand?" His expression wavered. "That will remain unwritten." For a moment, she nearly reached for him. Nearly. Instead, she inclined her head. "Safe travels, Mr. Whitmore." The use of his surname was deliberate. It hurt him, she saw it, but he bowed in return. "Miss Ashford." He left without turning back. Sophie watched from the window as his carriage disappeared down the curved street. Only when it vanished entirely did she allow herself to sit. Bath required composure. It required routine. Sophie applied herself to charitable administration with unexpected diligence. She assisted Mrs. Davenport in organizing relief funds for veterans' families. She learned to balance accounts. She met solicitors and corresponded with merchants. Responsibility steadied her. Months passed. Letters arrived from Julian with impeccable regularity. They contained updates on property matters, architectural proposals, minor social observations. Nothing personal, nothing reckless. Not once did he mention Charlotte Harrington. Not once did he refer to longing. Sophie replied in kind, measured, polite. Each envelope felt like a performance. In her second year in Bath, she accepted a position assisting a local solicitor, Mr. Pembroke, whose progressive views permitted women to manage documentation discreetly. "You possess unusual clarity," he remarked one afternoon, as she corrected a contract clause. "Have you considered formal study?" She smiled faintly. "I have considered survival." He laughed softly. "You will do more than survive, Miss Ashford." For the first time since leaving London, she allowed herself to imagine a future not defined by scandal or sacrifice. She grew into herself. Her posture altered. Her voice strengthened. She no longer felt like cargo moved for safety. She felt capable, independent. Still, certain evenings brought memory unbidden. The orchard in Kent, the rain in Bloomsbury, the letters, and the hand that had hovered but never touched. 2 full years passed before the letter arrived that changed everything. It was not from Julian. It was from a mutual acquaintance in London. You may wish to know that Miss Harrington's engagement has been postponed indefinitely. Sophie read the line twice, then a third time. Postponed, not announced, not celebrated. Postponed. Her heart beat unevenly. She told herself it meant nothing. Yet, weeks later, another letter came. This one in Julian's hand. I trust Bath continues to suit you. Matters in London have altered. I have withdrawn from certain negotiations. You need not concern yourself. Withdrawn. The word echoed. She wrote back immediately. Altered how? The reply was delayed. When it came, it was brief. My father and I are no longer aligned in business. I have secured independent commission. You are safe, safe, always safe. She folded the letter slowly. Safety had cost him something. She knew it. Rumours reached Bath soon after. Edmund Whitmore's investments had faltered. Questions of legality had surfaced. A discreet investigation had begun. Nothing publicly catastrophic, yet enough to tarnish. Sophie understood then. Julian had not merely resisted. He had acted, and action had consequences. Another year passed. Her correspondence with him shifted subtly, less guarded, still restrained, but warmer. He asked about her work, about her opinions, about books she was reading. He began to sign his letters not simply J, but Julian. One spring afternoon, as she sorted documents at Mr. Pembroke's office, a carriage halted outside with unmistakable precision. Sophie's breath caught before she even saw him. Julian entered without flourish, without announcement, just as he always had. He looked older, not diminished, tempered. Miss Ashford, he greeted quietly. The formal address trembled slightly. Mr. Whitmore. Mr. Pembroke, sensing something unspoken, excused himself tactfully. When they were alone, silence settled like memory. You look well, Julian said. So do you. That is untrue. She studied him more closely. The discipline remained, but the edge had softened. What has happened? She asked gently. My father faces inquiry, he replied. And you? I no longer share his name in practice. The statement startled her. You separated from him entirely. Yes. For business? For conscience? Their eyes held. You chose differently, she said softly. Yes. Why? His gaze did not waver. Because distance did not cure anything. Her pulse quickened. And now? Now, he said quietly. I have secured my own commission in London. And Miss Harrington. He shook his head once. She will marry advantage elsewhere. The relief she felt was immediate and dangerous. Why have you come? She asked. Julian stepped closer, not touching, but closer than before. I came, he said, because I will not let another year pass governed by fear. Her breath faltered. Fear of scandal. Fear of losing you entirely. The words landed gently, yet they altered everything. She searched his face for hesitation, found none. Do you understand what this means? She asked. Yes. And if London whispers again, let it whisper. And if society condemns, then we endure honestly. The distinction mattered. He reached for her then. This time his hand did not stop. It brushed her fingers, warm, real. No thunder cracked. No door burst open, only a quiet, undeniable contact. For the first time, restraint yielded to truth. Come back to London, he said softly. Sophie's heart raced. Not as protection, she replied. No, as partner. The word carried weight. Not sister, not responsibility, partner. She understood then how much they had both changed. Love had not faded in distance. It had matured, strengthened, no longer desperate, no longer defensive, just certain. Sophie inhaled slowly. Yes, she said. And in that simple word, the years of silence, sacrifice, and separation began to find their answer. London did whisper. It always would. When Sophie returned the following season, not as a sheltered girl, but as a woman with her own work, her own reputation, her own quiet confidence, the city noticed. It measured her, it recalculated, but it did not devour her. Julian had prepared carefully. His separation from Edmund Whitmore was no longer rumour, but fact. Legal ties in business had been dissolved, financial independence secured. His architectural commission, earned through merit rather than paternal influence, had granted him a footing that could not easily be shaken. He no longer stood in his father's shadow, and Sophie no longer stood behind his protection. They walked into London differently, not as guardian and ward, not as siblings rehearsing restraint, but as two adults who had endured distance long enough to understand the cost of silence. The first public appearance was deliberate. A modest gathering hosted by Mr. Pembroke, now visiting from Bath. Sophie entered the room at Julian's side, not clinging, not hidden, simply present. Conversations paused, not dramatically but noticeably. Miss Caroline Avery raised a brow. Mrs. Lytton adjusted her spectacles. Miss Charlotte Harrington, now engaged to a discreetly advantageous gentleman, inclined her head with composed civility. No one spoke the word impropriety. No one dared, because there was no scandal to hold. There had been no flight, no clandestine meetings, no reckless confession in shadowed corridors. There had been time, separation, growth. Julian did not rush declarations. He did not corner her in gardens. He did not seize her hand in defiance. He asked, formally, properly, in a drawing room filled with light. "Sophie Ashford," he said quietly when they were alone at last, "will you allow me to court you openly?" She smiled, not as the girl who had once trembled in Kent, but as the woman Bath had shaped. "You intend to ask my permission?" she teased gently. "Yes, and if I refuse, I will endure." She laughed softly. "And if I accept?" His gaze warmed in a way it never had before. "Then I will never again call love a weakness." The courtship was brief, not because affection lacked depth, but because it had already survived years. When the formal announcement was made, London reacted with restrained astonishment. They had been raised as siblings. Yes, but not by blood, not by law that could not be untangled. Society examined the timeline, the distance, the separation, the propriety observed, and finding no scandal that could be substantiated, it settled into reluctant acceptance. Edmund Whitmore did not attend the wedding. His influence had waned significantly under quiet inquiry. His reputation no longer commanded fear. He had underestimated the power of patience. The ceremony itself was understated. Held in a modest chapel near Bloomsbury, Mrs. Davenport attended from Bath. Mr. Pembroke stood proudly near the front. Charlotte Harrington sent a polite note of goodwill. When Sophie stood before Julian, there was no trembling of forbidden impulse, no sense of trespass, only recognition. He did not look at her as something fragile, nor as something he must guard. He looked at her as an equal. And when he finally took her hand without restraint, without hesitation, it did not feel like rebellion. It felt like resolution. Afterward, they did not retreat from London. They remained, worked, built. Julian's architectural practice flourished under his independent name. Sophie assisted in contracts and correspondence, her clarity invaluable. They were spoken of, not as scandal, but as an unusual match that had matured into strength. The whispers faded. Not because London changed, but because they no longer fed them. Years later, when someone remarked lightly that they had once lived under the same roof as siblings, Sophie smiled. "Yes," she replied, "and we learned restraint." Julian would glance at her then, something almost amused in his expression. Restraint had not been the end of their story. It had been its foundation. There are loves that burn brightly and vanish. There are loves that rebel and collapse. And there are loves that endure silence, distance, and fear, and emerge not diminished, but clarified. She had once believed he saw her only as a sister. He had once believed loving her would destroy her. They had both been wrong. Love, when guided by patience rather than impulse, does not demand ruin. It demands courage. Courage to wait. Courage to separate when necessary. Courage to return without shame. In a world that measures affection against reputation, their greatest act of defiance had not been confession. It had been restraint until truth could stand without destroying them both. And sometimes, the deepest love is not the one that reaches first. It is the one that waits long enough to hold without fear. Reflection. There are moments in life when feeling something deeply seems dangerous, when silence appears safer than confession, when distance feels wiser than desire. But time does not always extinguish what is true. Sometimes it refines it. Sometimes it reveals whether affection was born of confinement or of conviction. Sophie and Julian learned that love is not proven by urgency. It is proven by endurance, by the willingness to protect not only one another, but the dignity of what they felt. And perhaps that is the quiet lesson hidden beneath candlelight and whispered rumor, that being seen, truly seen, may take years. But when it happens honestly, no society can forbid it. If this story moved you, if you believe in love that waits rather than rushes, if you cherish romances shaped by restraint, courage, and time, then stay with us. Subscribe for more historical stories where silence speaks louder than scandal. And tell me, do you believe love grows stronger through distance, or is it meant to defy the world at once?